The harmattan winds howled across the northern Sahel, carrying fine particles of sand that stung like needles against exposed skin. Captain Ibrahim Traoré adjusted the scarf around his face, squinting against the assault of dust that turned the midday sky into a hazy veil of orange and brown. The temperature had already climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, and it was barely noon. This was the Burkina Faso that few outsiders understood, a land of extremes where survival itself required constant vigilance. Traoré stood atop a rocky outcrop, surveying the landscape below through weathered binoculars. Behind him, a convoy of military vehicles waited, engines idling, their occupants seeking whatever shade they could find. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a seemingly infinite expanse of scrub brush, acacia trees, and sandy soil that characterized the transition zone between the Sahara Desert to the north and the more fertile lands to the south. "Captain, we should move soon," called Lieutenant Caboret, climbing up beside him. The younger officer's uniform was already caked with dust, despite their having left the forward base less than 3 hours ago. "The men are getting restless, and we still have 30 kilometers to cover before nightfall." Traoré lowered his binoculars, his jaw set with determination. He had been conducting these patrols for years now, ever since the insurgency had exploded across the Sahel. The jihadist groups, JNIM, Islamic State affiliates, and various other militant organizations, had turned this region into one of the most dangerous places on earth. Villages that once thrived now stood empty. Their inhabitants fled to displacement camps or worse. "We move in 5 minutes," Traoré replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. "But I want to check that compound first." He pointed toward a cluster of buildings about 2 kilometers to the east, barely visible through the dust-laden air. "Intelligence suggested militant activity in this sector last week. We need to verify it's clear before we pass through." Caboret followed his gaze, his expression uncertain. "Sir, those buildings have been abandoned for months, maybe longer. The drought drove everyone out of this area. It's just empty shells now." "Maybe," Traoré acknowledged, sliding the binoculars back into their case. "But empty buildings make perfect staging grounds for insurgents. We've seen it before. They use abandoned compounds as weapons caches, meeting points, safe houses. 5 minutes to check could save us from an ambush later." The lieutenant nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his captain's words. Traoré had earned his reputation through careful attention to detail, through understanding that in counterinsurgency operations, the smallest overlooked detail could mean the difference between life and death. He had been promoted to captain 2 years earlier, after demonstrating exceptional tactical acumen during operations in the north-central region. But even before that promotion, his fellow soldiers had known he was different, focused, determined, driven by something deeper than mere duty. As they descended from the outcrop, Traoré's mind wandered briefly to his education at the University of Ouagadougou, where he had studied geology. He had once imagined a different life for himself, perhaps working in Burkina Faso's growing mining sector, helping to unlock the country's mineral wealth. But the insurgency had changed everything, had transformed the trajectory of his life and the lives of millions of his countrymen. The convoy reformed quickly, with Traoré's vehicle taking point. They moved across the desert terrain with practiced efficiency, navigating around larger rocks and the occasional dried riverbed that scarred the landscape. Through the windshield, Traoré could see the buildings growing larger, their mud brick walls still standing despite months or perhaps years of neglect. "Check your weapons," he commanded over the radio. "Stay alert. If there's any sign of recent activity, we pull back and call for reinforcements." The compound consisted of 4 main structures arranged around a central courtyard. At one time, it had likely been a small village, or perhaps an outpost for livestock herders. Now it stood silent and still, a monument to the displacement that had emptied so much of the northern Sahel. As the vehicles approached, Traoré studied every detail, the way the sand had drifted against the walls, the condition of the wooden doors, any sign that someone had been here recently. They stopped 50 meters from the nearest building, and Traoré stepped out into the scorching heat. Immediately, he could feel the difference between the air-conditioned interior of the vehicle and the furnace-like environment outside. He raised his hand, signaling for a tactical approach. "Caboret, take 3 men and clear the building on the left. I'll take the main structure with Sergeant Ouedraogo. The rest of you maintain security on the perimeter. Nobody enters the compound until we've confirmed it's clear." As his team moved into position, Traoré felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potential contact. His hand rested on the grip of his rifle, finger alongside the trigger guard, ready but not threatening. Every sense heightened, he approached the main building's entrance, its wooden door hanging partially open, creaking slightly in the desert wind. Chapter 2. The interior of the building was dimmer than Traoré had expected, the few windows having been partially blocked by accumulated sand and debris. He paused in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the reduced light, his rifle raised and ready. Beside him, Sergeant Ouedraogo moved with equal caution, his own weapon tracking left, while Traoré covered right. "Clear left," Ouedraogo whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind outside. "Moving," Traoré responded, stepping fully into what had once been the main living area of the structure. The floor was covered in a layer of fine sand that had blown in through every crack and crevice, creating drifts in the corners. Broken pottery lay scattered near what had been a cooking area, and a few tattered pieces of fabric, perhaps curtains or clothing, hung from rusty nails in the walls. But something was wrong. Traoré's instincts, honed by countless operations, told him that this abandonment was too neat, too organized. In his experience, when people fled in panic from insurgent attacks, they left chaos behind: overturned furniture, personal belongings scattered in desperate haste, signs of genuine terror. This space, despite its apparent abandonment, felt different. He moved deeper into the room, his boots leaving clear prints in the sandy floor. That was when he noticed them. Other boot prints, partially obscured by the natural drift of sand but still visible. Recent prints, no more than a few days old at most, leading toward the back of the building. "Sergeant," he said quietly, gesturing toward the tracks. "We're not alone." Ouedraogo's expression hardened, and he raised his radio to alert the rest of the team. But before he could transmit, Traoré held up his hand, stopping him. There was something else, something his mind was processing even as he struggled to identify it. A smell, faint but distinct, cutting through the dusty, sun-baked air of the abandoned building. Gun oil, fresh gun oil. Traoré's heart rate increased, but his movements remained controlled, deliberate. He followed the boot prints toward a doorway at the rear of the main room, leading into what must have been a storage area, or perhaps a private chamber. The door was closed, unusual in an abandoned building where everything else stood open to the elements. He positioned himself beside the door, motioning for Ouedraogo to cover him from behind. With one swift motion, he pushed the door open and swept into the space beyond, his rifle tracking for threats. The room was empty of people, but what he saw there made him freeze mid-step. The space had been converted into something entirely unexpected. Along one wall, wooden crates were stacked neatly, their sides marked with Cyrillic characters, Russian writing. Traoré recognized it from his military training, from briefings about foreign involvement in the region's conflicts. On a makeshift table in the center of the room sat a portable radio transmitter, sophisticated equipment far beyond what local insurgent groups typically possessed. Maps covered one section of the wall, marked with positions and routes throughout northern Burkina Faso and into neighboring Mali and Niger. But it was what he saw pinned beside the maps that truly shocked him. Photographs, surveillance photos of government installations, military convoys, and what appeared to be planning documents for operations. And there, unmistakable in their distinct coloring and format, were documents bearing the insignia of foreign military advisors. Not just any foreign advisors, but specifically identified intelligence materials from countries that supposedly had no official presence in this region. "Captain," Ouedraogo breathed, stepping up beside him. "What is this?" Traoré's mind raced, pieces falling into place with disturbing clarity. This wasn't just an insurgent safe house. This was a coordination center, a hub for foreign-backed operations that went far beyond the local jihadist insurgency everyone knew about. The sophistication of the equipment, the quality of the intelligence materials, the organizational structure evident in how everything was arranged. This spoke of external support at levels that were supposed to be impossible in this remote region. "We need to document everything," Traoré said, his voice tight with the weight of what they had discovered. "Photographs, inventories, everything. And we need to do it fast. If this place is still active, someone might be coming back." As Ouedraogo began photographing the scene with his mobile phone, Traoré moved to examine the crates more closely. He used his knife to carefully pry open the lid of one, revealing contents that confirmed his worst fears. Weapons, yes, but also communications equipment, medical supplies marked with foreign pharmaceutical labels, and what appeared to be training manuals written in multiple languages. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted one of the manuals, flipping through pages that detailed advanced tactical operations, ambush strategies, and counterintelligence techniques. This wasn't the work of local militants who had learned their craft through tribal conflicts and religious extremism. This was professional, military-grade operational planning. "Sir," Traoré's voice crackled over the radio. "We've finished clearing the other buildings. They're empty, but we found vehicle tracks leading away to the north, recent ones, maybe 12 to 24 hours old." Traoré keyed his radio. "Understood. Maintain security. We're going to be here for at least another 30 minutes. Nobody enters this building except Sergeant Ouedraogo and myself until we've finished documentation." He turned back to the room, methodically working to capture every detail. Each item told a story. Each document revealed another layer of a conspiracy that seemed to extend far beyond what anyone in Burkina Faso's military command had imagined. The foreign involvement in the Sahel insurgency was an open secret. Everyone knew various external powers had interests in the region, but this level of direct operational support, this degree of coordination and infrastructure, suggested something much deeper and more troubling. As he worked, Traoré's thoughts turned to the broader implications of what they had found. The insurgency in Burkina Faso had already displaced over 2 million people, killed thousands of civilians and soldiers, and threatened to tear apart the social fabric of the nation. If foreign powers were actively fueling this conflict, using it as a proxy battleground for their own geopolitical interests, then the solutions everyone had been pursuing, military operations, peace negotiations, international cooperation, might all be based on false premises. Chapter 3. The sun had shifted lower in the sky by the time Traoré and his team finished their initial documentation of the safe house. The temperature had begun its slow descent from the day's peak, though it still hovered well above 35 degrees Celsius. Outside, the harmattan winds had intensified, creating small dust devils that danced across the desert landscape like restless spirits. Traoré sat in the shade of his vehicle, reviewing the photographs on Ouedraogo's phone while the sergeant prepared a detailed written report. The rest of the team maintained security, their weapons trained on the approaches to the compound, aware now that they had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple, abandoned building. "Captain," Traoré approached, his expression troubled. "I've been thinking about what we found in there. If foreign powers are directly supporting insurgent operations at this level, who else knows about it? Our commanders? The government? Or have we just discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden?" It was the same question that had been turning through Traoré's mind for the past hour. The implications of their discovery extended far beyond military tactics or even national security. This touched on sovereignty, on the fundamental question of who was really controlling the conflict that was tearing Burkina Faso apart. "I don't know," Traoré admitted, his honesty reflecting the trust he had built with his men. "But what I do know is that this information needs to reach the right people, people who can actually do something about it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "People who put Burkina Faso's interests first, above all other considerations." Traoré nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those words. In a country that had experienced multiple coups and where foreign influence had shaped politics for decades, identifying such people was easier said than done. But both men knew that Captain Traoré was thinking of his own chain of command, of the officers who had risen through the ranks fighting this insurgency firsthand, who had watched their soldiers die and their country bleed. "We should move soon," Ouedraogo interjected, approaching with his completed report. "If this safe house is as active as the fresh tracks suggest, we don't want to be here when whoever uses it returns. We might have the element of surprise now, but that won't last if we linger." Traoré stood, accepting the report and scanning its contents. Ouedraogo had been thorough, documenting not just what they had found, but also the specific locations within the compound, the condition of materials, and his professional assessment of how recently the site had been occupied. It was solid military intelligence work, the kind that could form the foundation of a larger investigation. One more thing before we leave, Traoré decided, tucking the report into his jacket pocket. I want to take some of those documents with us, the ones with foreign markings. Physical evidence will be harder to dismiss than photographs alone. He re-entered the building, moving quickly now, selecting several key documents from the wall display and carefully removing them without disturbing the overall scene too much. Part of him hoped that other teams might have the opportunity to examine this site more thoroughly, to bring in proper intelligence analysts who could extract every piece of information it contained. But another part of him, the part that had learned hard lessons about how information could be suppressed or manipulated, wanted insurance in the form of physical proof he could personally deliver to trusted hands. As he emerged with his selections tucked into a weatherproof document case, he found his entire team ready to move, vehicles running, weapons loaded. They understood the gravity of what they had found, and with that understanding came a new tension, an awareness that they had crossed an invisible threshold. Knowledge brought responsibility, and responsibility in matters like this could be dangerous. The convoy began its journey back toward their forward operating base, but Traoré ordered a different route than their inbound path. It was a basic security measure. Never return the same way you came when operating in hostile territory, but it took on added significance now. If their discovery became known to the wrong people, ambush was a real possibility. As the kilometers passed beneath their wheels, Traoré found himself reflecting on the path that had led him to this moment. He thought about his childhood in Bondoukoui, a small town in western Burkina Faso, where life had been simpler, where the greatest concerns had been crops and rainfall rather than insurgencies and foreign interference. He thought about his university studies, the dreams he had once held of contributing to his country's development through its mineral resources, through peaceful means. But life had not followed that peaceful path. The insurgency had erupted, spreading from Mali like wildfire, consuming village after village, displacing families, destroying livelihoods. And so he had joined the military, believing that Burkina Faso's salvation would come through the dedication of its own people, through soldiers willing to stand against the chaos and violence. "Sir, vehicle approaching from the north," the driver announced, breaking Traoré's reverie. Single truck, civilian pattern. Traoré sat up straighter, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. In this region, innocent civilian traffic was rare. More often, vehicles encountered in remote areas were either insurgents or smugglers, and the line between the two was often blurred. "Slow down but don't stop," he ordered. "Maintain formation and keep weapons ready but not overtly threatening. Let's see what they do." The approaching truck came into clearer view as the distance closed between them. It was indeed a civilian vehicle, an old Toyota pickup that had seen better days, its paint faded by sun and sand. In the back, Traoré could see what appeared to be farming equipment and several jerry cans, probably containing water or fuel. The truck slowed as it neared the convoy, and Traoré raised his hand in a neutral gesture, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply acknowledging the other vehicle's presence. The driver, an older man with weathered features that spoke of decades under the Sahelian sun, raised his own hand in response but kept moving, clearly eager to avoid any interaction with military forces. It was a common reaction. Too many civilians had been caught in the crossfire of the insurgency, had seen their villages burned, their families torn apart. Trust in government forces, while stronger than trust in the insurgents, was still fragile, damaged by years of inadequate protection and occasional heavy-handed operations. Chapter 4. Night had fallen by the time the convoy reached their forward operating base, a fortified compound on the outskirts of Djibo, the capital of Soum province. The base consisted of a series of concrete buildings surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire, with guard towers at each corner providing overlapping fields of fire. Generators hummed in the background, providing electricity for lights and communications equipment. Traoré dismissed his men with orders to rest and resupply, but asked Lieutenant Kabore and Sergeant Ouedraogo to join him in his office once they had cleaned up. The small space was Spartan: a metal desk, a few chairs, a map of the region on the wall marked with colored pins indicating known insurgent activity and cleared areas. A portable fan struggled against the lingering heat of the day. While he waited, Traoré secured the documents they had recovered in his personal safe, then sat down to compose his initial report. The words came slowly, carefully, as he struggled to convey the significance of their discovery without overstating what they had found. In military reports, precision mattered. Exaggeration could undermine credibility, while understatement might cause critical information to be overlooked. But how did one precisely describe stumbling upon evidence of foreign-backed insurgent operations at a level that suggested systematic, long-term support? How did one frame such a discovery in terms that would prompt immediate action rather than bureaucratic delays? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Traoré and Ouedraogo entered, both having changed into fresh uniforms, though fatigue still lined their faces. They had been on patrol for 16 hours, most of it under the punishing desert sun, and the day's discoveries had added mental exhaustion to physical tiredness. "Sit," Traoré gestured to the chairs. "I want to discuss how we proceed with this information. We've documented what we found, but documentation alone won't drive action. We need to make sure this reaches people who have both the authority and the will to investigate further." "Colonel Damiba," Ouedraogo suggested, referring to their regional commander. "He's always been straight with the troops, and he's fought in these operations himself. He understands what's happening on the ground." Traoré nodded slowly. Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba was indeed someone who had earned respect through his direct involvement in counterinsurgency operations. But Traoré's mind was already moving beyond immediate chain of command. Considering the broader political implications of what they had found, Colonel Damiba should definitely see this, he agreed. "But I'm thinking we may need to go higher, to ensure this doesn't get buried at some intermediate level where people might have reasons to suppress it." Traoré leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're talking about going to Ouagadougou, to military headquarters. That's risky, sir. You'd be bypassing normal channels, and if the wrong people hear about it first, they could block you, or worse." It was a valid concern. Burkina Faso's military, like many institutions in countries affected by prolonged conflict, had developed complex internal politics, rivalries between units, disagreements over strategy, and the corrupting influence of both local and foreign interests created a minefield that honest officers had to navigate carefully. "I know the risks," Traoré acknowledged. "But I also know the cost of letting this information die in someone's desk drawer. We have displaced camps full of people who lost everything to this insurgency. We have soldiers dying in ambushes planned with intelligence that shouldn't be available to the insurgents. If foreign powers are actively fueling this conflict, our entire strategy needs to change." The room fell silent as both men absorbed their captain's words. They knew he was right, but they also understood that being right was not always enough protection when challenging powerful interests. "There's something else," Traoré continued, his voice dropping lower. "Something I've been thinking about during the drive back. That safe house, it wasn't just a random insurgent hideout. It was too sophisticated, too well-equipped. And its location, right in this region where we've been having the most trouble with coordinated attacks, can't be coincidence." "You think there are more of them?" Ouedraogo asked. "I think what we found today is part of a larger network, and I think the reason our operations have been so difficult, the reason we seem to be always one step behind the insurgents, is because someone is feeding them information and resources we can't match. Not because we're not good soldiers, but because we're fighting an enemy that has external support at levels we weren't prepared for." Traoré stood and walked to the map on the wall, studying the marked positions. "If you're right, then this changes everything. Every patrol we run, every operation we plan, we'd have to assume it might be compromised. We'd have to change how we communicate, how we move, everything." "Exactly," Traoré confirmed, "which is why this needs to reach the right people immediately. Tomorrow I'll request a meeting with Colonel Damiba. If he agrees with my assessment, I'll take leave to travel to Ouagadougou personally. This isn't something that can be handled through normal report channels." After his officers left, Traoré sat alone in his office, staring at the safe that contained the documents that might change everything. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of the base at night: guards changing shifts, vehicles being maintained, the distant generator providing power, and, paradoxically, a sense of normalcy in an abnormal situation. He thought about the burden of knowledge, about how sometimes discovering the truth created more problems than it solved. But he also thought about the men and women suffering because of this conflict, about the displaced families, the orphaned children, the destroyed villages. If foreign powers were using Burkina Faso as a proxy battleground for their own interests, then exposing that truth was worth whatever personal risks it entailed. His mind turned to the broader context of Burkina Faso's situation. The country had been struggling even before the insurgency intensified, struggling with poverty, with climate change that brought unpredictable rainfall and expanding deserts, with a young population desperate for opportunities that seemed increasingly scarce. The insurgency had taken all those existing challenges and amplified them into a humanitarian catastrophe. But what if the solutions were being actively sabotaged by external actors who benefited from the chaos? What if the billions spent on security operations, on humanitarian aid, on development programs were all being undermined by foreign powers playing their own game? Chapter 5. Dawn broke over Djibo with its usual sudden intensity, the sun rising rapidly above the eastern horizon and immediately asserting its dominance over the landscape. Traoré had slept poorly, his mind churning through the implications of their discovery and the various ways the coming days might unfold. He found Colonel Damiba in the operations center, studying reports from overnight patrols. The colonel was in his late 40s, a career officer who had witnessed Burkina Faso's transformation from a relatively stable country to one locked in a desperate struggle against multiple insurgent groups. His uniform was always immaculate despite the dust and heat, a small gesture of maintaining standards in circumstances that constantly threatened to erode them. "Captain Traoré," Damiba looked up as Traoré entered. "I heard your patrol returned late last night. Anything to report?" "Yes, sir. Something significant." Traoré handed over the written report, along with selected photographs on a tablet computer. "We discovered what appears to be a foreign-backed insurgent safehouse, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of here. The evidence suggests operational coordination at levels we haven't previously documented." Damiba's expression remained neutral as he began reviewing the materials, but Traoré noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set more firmly as he progressed through the documentation. The colonel was seeing what Traoré had seen, the unmistakable signs of sophisticated external support. "First, these Russian markings," Damiba said quietly, pointing to one of the photographs. "And these, what language is this on the communications equipment?" "We believe it's a mixture of French and Arabic, sir, but with technical terminology that suggests professional military translation rather than native speakers." Damiba set down the tablet and looked directly at Traoré. "Captain, do you understand what you found here? This isn't just evidence of foreign weapon sales or even advisory support. This suggests active operational coordination, safe houses, intelligence sharing, logistics support. If this is real, and if it's as widespread as I suspect it might be, we're facing a much more complex situation than anyone has been willing to acknowledge." "I understand, sir. That's why I wanted to bring this to your attention personally. This needs to reach the highest levels of command, but it also needs to reach people who will actually act on it rather than bury it for political reasons." The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the base compound. Outside, soldiers were conducting morning training, running through their drills with practiced precision. Young men and women, many barely out of their teens, preparing to face an enemy that was apparently receiving support they couldn't match. "The situation in Ouagadougou is complicated right now," Damiba said finally, his back still to Traoré. "There's increasing frustration with how the war is being conducted, growing questions about foreign influence in our politics, debates about who our real allies are. If you take this information to the capital, you could be walking into a political firestorm. With respect, sir, political firestorms are preferable to soldiers dying because of compromised operations. If what we found is part of a larger network, then our current strategies are based on false assumptions. We need to know the truth, whatever the political consequences." Damiba turned back to face him, and Traoré saw something in the colonel's expression that he hadn't expected, not surprise or concern, but a kind of recognition, as if Traoré had confirmed something the colonel had already been suspecting. "You're right, of course," Damiba said, "but you need to understand that taking this forward might put you at risk. Not just physical risk from insurgents, but political risk from people who might prefer these truths remain hidden. Are you prepared for that?" "Sir, I joined the military to protect Burkina Faso and its people. If that means taking risks to expose threats to our sovereignty, Then yes, I'm prepared. The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded decisively. Very well. I'll arrange transportation to Ouagadougou for tomorrow. You'll carry my personal endorsement of your findings, which should help you get meetings with the right people. But Captain, once you're in the capital, you'll be largely on your own. I can open doors, Werte, but I can't shield you from the consequences of what you reveal. As Traoré left the operations center, he felt the weight of the path he had chosen settling more firmly on his shoulders. There was no turning back now, no way to unknow what they had discovered. He would go to Ouagadougou, would present his evidence to whoever would listen, and would face whatever came after. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. He briefed his immediate subordinates on temporary command arrangements, secured the physical evidence in transport containers that could be locked and sealed, and made copies of all the digital documentation, storing them in multiple locations in case something happened to the primary evidence. Lieutenant Cabore found him in the early evening, as Traoré was conducting a final inventory of the materials he would take to the capital. Sir, the men wanted me to tell you, we're with you on this. Whatever happens in Ouagadougou, whatever comes from your reports, we stand behind the accuracy of what we found. If anyone questions your documentation, we're ready to provide supporting testimony. Traoré looked up at his young officer, seeing in him the same dedication that had driven Traoré himself to join the military. These were good soldiers, honest men who had put their lives on the line repeatedly for their country. They deserved leadership that would take the risks necessary to give them a real chance at success. Thank you, Lieutenant. Tell the men I appreciate their support, and tell them that whatever I discover in Ouagadougou, whatever changes might come from this, it's all aimed at making sure their sacrifices mean something. We can't win this war if we're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, while foreign powers stack the deck against us. Up to 6. The military transport to Ouagadougou departed before dawn. Traoré, sitting in the back with his secured evidence containers and a single small bag of personal belongings. The 400-kilometer journey would take most of the day, traveling through a country that bore the scars of conflict at every turn. As the vehicle moved south, leaving the harsh Sahelian landscape behind and entering regions where vegetation gradually became more robust, Traoré watched the countryside pass by. They passed through checkpoints every 50 kilometers or so, manned by combinations of military and police forces, each one a reminder of how insecurity had transformed daily life in Burkina Faso. They also passed displacement camps, sprawling collections of tents and makeshift shelters that housed thousands of people who had fled their villages ahead of insurgent attacks. Children played in the dust between the shelters, their laughter a testament to resilience in the face of circumstances that would have broken many adults. Women queued at water distribution points, carrying jerry cans that represented the difference between survival and disaster. Men sat in small groups in whatever shade they could find, their faces reflecting the particular frustration of having been forced from their homes, unable to protect their families or maintain their livelihoods. These were the people Traoré was fighting for, he reminded himself. Not abstract concepts of sovereignty or national security, but real human beings whose lives had been shattered by a conflict that foreign powers were apparently content to prolong for their own purposes. The landscape continued to change as they approached Ouagadougou. The capital sat in the more fertile central region of the country, where rainfall was more reliable and agriculture more productive. But even here, the signs of strain were evident. Increased military presence on the streets, security checkpoints at major intersections, the visible tension of a population aware that the conflict in the north could spread at any time. They arrived at military headquarters in the early afternoon, a sprawling complex of colonial-era buildings that had been expanded and fortified over the decades. Traoré was directed to a guest barracks, where he could store his belongings and refresh himself before his scheduled meetings. Colonel Damiba had been true to his word. Traoré's first appointment was scheduled for the following morning with a senior intelligence officer, who apparently had the ear of the country's top military leadership. But even as Traoré prepared for that meeting, reviewing his evidence and rehearsing how to present his findings most effectively, he sensed undercurrents in the capital that were absent in the forward operating bases. Officers passed in the corridors, speaking in hushed tones, their conversations dying as Traoré approached. There was a tension in the air, something beyond the normal stress of wartime operations. It felt almost like a city holding its breath, waiting for something to break. That evening, Traoré found himself in the officer's mess, surrounded by personnel from various units and commands. The conversations around him revealed deep frustrations, complaints about inadequate equipment, about operations that seemed to achieve nothing, about a political leadership that appeared more concerned with maintaining foreign relationships than winning the war. "They're bleeding us dry," a major from an Eastern command was saying to a small group. "We lose soldiers every week. And for what? So that foreign powers can maintain their influence here, so that politicians can keep receiving their aid payments." Another officer, older, with more ribbons on his uniform, cautioned restraint. "Careful how you speak, Major. Such talk can be interpreted as seditious, especially in current circumstances." "Seditious?" The Major laughed bitterly. "So what's seditious is sending soldiers to die while handcuffing them with rules of engagement designed to protect foreign interests rather than Burkinabe lives." Traoré listened but did not contribute, aware that as an outsider from the northern commands, his words might be misconstrued. But he recognized in these conversations echoes of his own frustrations, reflections of the same questions that had driven him to bring his evidence to Ouagadougou. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more and more content. Later, alone in his assigned quarters, Traoré laid out the documents he had recovered from the safe house, studying them again in the light of what he had heard that evening. The foreign markings, the sophisticated equipment, the level of operational planning. All of it pointed to a truth that many officers were apparently already suspecting, even if they lacked the direct evidence to prove it. Burkina Faso was not just fighting an insurgency. It was fighting a proxy war in which foreign powers used local instability to pursue their own agendas. The insurgents were real enough, their grievances and ideology genuine in their own right. But the sustainability of their operations, their ability to recover from setbacks and maintain pressure across multiple fronts, suggested they were receiving support that went far beyond what local recruitment and resource extraction could provide. Chapter 7. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Traoré dressed carefully in his cleanest uniform, ensuring every element of his appearance conveyed the professionalism and seriousness his mission required. He secured the evidence containers, double-checking that all documentation was organized and easily accessible. The senior intelligence officer he was scheduled to meet, Colonel Ouattara, maintained an office in one of the newer buildings in the headquarters complex. His assistant, a young lieutenant, showed Traoré into a conference room rather than a personal office, a sign that this meeting was being taken seriously, that multiple people might need to review the evidence. Colonel Ouattara arrived 15 minutes later, accompanied by two other officers, whose ranks and bearings suggested they held significant positions in the command structure. Introductions were brief and formal, and then Ouattara gestured for Traoré to begin his presentation. "Captain, Colonel Damiba's communication suggested you've discovered something significant during routine patrol operations. Please, walk us through what you found and why you believe it merits this level of attention." Traoré had spent hours preparing for this moment, organizing his thoughts and evidence into a logical narrative that would build from the initial discovery to the broader implications. He began with the patrol itself, describing the decision to investigate the abandoned compound, the discovery of recent activity, and then the contents of the safe house. As he spoke, he distributed photographs, displayed documents, and pointed out specific details that supported his conclusions. The senior officers listened attentively, occasionally interrupting with questions that suggested they were following his logic and understanding the significance of what he was presenting. "These Russian markings," one of the officers, a brigadier general whose nameplate identified him as Yameogo, said, examining one of the documents closely. "Combined with the communications equipment you photographed, this suggests operational coordination, not just arms sales. Someone is providing real-time support to insurgent operations." "Yes, sir," Traoré confirmed, "and the sophistication of the intelligence materials we found suggests they have access to information about our force dispositions, patrol schedules, and operational plans. That could only come from either extensive surveillance capabilities or from someone providing them information from within our own ranks." Colonel Ouattara finished grimly. "You're suggesting we have a security breach at a level that compromises operational security across the northern commands." "I'm suggesting we need to investigate that possibility, sir. The alternative, that the insurgents have developed their own intelligence capabilities to this degree, seems less likely given the evidence of foreign support we found. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Traoré was right, if there was indeed a network providing insurgents with internal information, then every operation planned in Ouagadougou might be compromised before it even began. Every patrol could be walking into prepared ambushes. Every supposed secure location might already be under surveillance. Brigadier General Yameogo stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned back to face the room, his expression was troubled but determined. "Captain Traoré, I want you to understand the gravity of what you've brought to our attention. This evidence, if authentic and if it represents a broader pattern, suggests we've been fighting this war under false assumptions. It would mean that our strategies, our tactics, our entire approach may need fundamental revision." "I understand, sir. That's exactly why I felt it necessary to bring this directly to command attention, rather than letting it get lost in routine intelligence reporting." "You've done the right thing," Ouattara assured him. "But now the question becomes what we do with this information. We need to verify your findings independently, investigate whether similar safe houses exist elsewhere, and determine the extent of foreign involvement in insurgent operations. That's going to require resources, coordination across multiple commands, and most importantly, absolute security. If the wrong people learn we're investigating this, the entire network could disappear before we can map its full extent." Another officer, who had been mostly silent during the presentation, finally spoke up. "There's also the political dimension to consider. If foreign powers are actively supporting insurgents, that implicates certain countries that officially present themselves as our allies. Exposing that would have diplomatic consequences. Diplomatic consequences are secondary to operational effectiveness," Yameogo stated flatly. "We owe it to the soldiers dying in the north to ensure they're fighting an enemy they can actually defeat, not one that's being artificially sustained by external support. Captain Traoré's evidence gives us the justification to investigate properly. We'd be derelict in our duty not to pursue it." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with the senior officers questioning Traoré about every aspect of his discovery, testing the reliability of his observations, and considering various interpretations of the evidence. Throughout it all, Traoré remained focused and precise, neither overstating what he had found nor downplaying its significance. Finally, Colonel Ouattara stood, signaling the meeting's conclusion. "Captain, we're going to need you to remain in Ouagadougou for at least a few more days while we begin preliminary investigations. Your direct knowledge of the site and the evidence will be valuable as we bring in specialists to analyze what you've found. In the meantime, I want you to prepare a detailed written report, more comprehensive than what you've already submitted, documenting not just what you found, but your professional assessment of what it means for our operations in the north." "Yes, sir. I'll begin immediately. One more thing," Yameogo added, his tone becoming more personal. "What you've done here takes courage, Captain. Not physical courage. You've already demonstrated that in combat, but the moral courage to bring forward information that powerful people might prefer to remain hidden. That kind of integrity is what Burkina Faso needs in its officers. Whatever comes from this investigation, remember that." Chapter 8. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activities. Traoré found himself in countless meetings, briefing different specialists on what he had discovered, answering the same questions from different perspectives, as various branches of the military and intelligence services tried to understand the implications of his findings. But he also had time to explore Ouagadougou, to see how the capital was dealing with the ongoing crisis. The city had swelled with displaced persons, its infrastructure straining under the pressure of providing services to a population that had grown far beyond its original capacity. Schools operated in double shifts to accommodate the influx of children from displaced families. Markets were crowded with people trying to make a living from whatever small trades they could establish. Yet there was also resilience, a determination that reflected something fundamental about the Burkinabe spirit. People adapted, created new opportunities, supported each other through extended family and community networks. Young entrepreneurs found creative ways to meet new demands. Community organizations mobilized to fill gaps in government services. It was, Traoré thought, a microcosm of how the country as a whole was responding to the crisis, not with collapse or surrender, but with resourceful determination. On the evening of his third day in the capital, Traoré received an unexpected summons. He was to present his findings to a special session of senior military leadership, including the Chief of Defense Staff. This was the highest level of military command, the place where strategic decisions about the war were made. The meeting was held in a secure conference room within the Defense Ministry, a space designed to prevent electronic surveillance and ensure complete confidentiality. Traoré entered to find a long table surrounded by the country's top military officers, men who collectively held responsibility for the lives of thousands of soldiers and the security of millions of citizens. The Chief of Defense Staff, General Ouedraogo, no relation to Traoré's sergeant, was a veteran officer with decades of experience. He gestured for Traoré to take a seat at the table, rather than standing to present, a small gesture that suggested this would be more conversation than formal briefing. "Captain Traoré," the general began, "we've all reviewed the evidence you've brought to our attention, and we've had our intelligence analysts examine your documentation. Their preliminary assessment confirms what you suspected. This safe house was part of a larger network, supporting insurgent operations with foreign assistance at a level we haven't previously documented. What we need from you now is your honest, professional judgment about what this means for how we're fighting this war." Traoré took a moment to organize his thoughts. This was not a time for hesitation or diplomatic evasion. These officers needed his direct assessment, even if it was uncomfortable. "Sir, based on what I found and what I've observed over 2 years of operations in the north, I believe we're fighting an enemy that has sustainable external support. That changes everything. It means that our current strategy of trying to degrade insurgent capabilities through attrition won't work, because they can simply receive new supplies, new weapons, new intelligence from external sources." He paused, then continued. "It also means that our operational security is compromised. If foreign powers are providing insurgents with information about our movements and plans, then every time we telegraph our intentions, through supply movements, troop concentrations, even routine patrol schedules, we're giving the enemy time to prepare ambushes or avoid contact." Another general, whose nameplate identified him as Sana, leaned forward. "So what do you recommend, Captain? How do we fight an enemy with that level of support?" "We need to change the fundamentals of how we operate, sir. Smaller units, more unpredictable movements, better operational security. We need to assume that anything planned at higher levels might be compromised, so we need to give ground commanders more autonomy to develop and execute operations locally. And most importantly, we need to identify and cut off the sources of external support. If we can disrupt the supply lines, the intelligence sharing, the coordination that foreign powers are providing, we level the playing field." General Ouedraogo nodded slowly. "You're describing a fundamental shift in our approach to the war. That's going to require resources we may not have, and it's going to require political will to confront foreign powers who present themselves as our allies." "Yes, sir, but the alternative is to continue fighting a war we can't win because the rules are stacked against us. Every soldier who dies in an ambush, every village that gets overrun, those costs are real, and they're being paid by Burkinabe people while foreign powers play their geopolitical games." The room fell silent, the weight of Traoré's words hanging in the air. These were senior officers, men who understood the costs of war personally, who had sent soldiers into combat knowing some would not return. But they also understood the political realities, the complex web of foreign relationships and domestic politics that constrained their options. Finally, General Ouedraogo spoke again. "Captain Traoré, your findings are going to serve as the foundation for a comprehensive review of our counterinsurgency strategy. We're going to investigate the extent of foreign support for insurgent operations. We're going to examine our operational security procedures, and we're going to develop new approaches based on the realities you've exposed, rather than the assumptions we've been operating under." He paused, then added something that surprised Traoré. "We're also going to need officers like you, officers who have the courage to question established practices, who put mission success above career advancement, who understand that serving Burkina Faso sometimes means challenging powerful interests. The investigation you've sparked is going to take months, and it's going to require dedicated personnel who can't be compromised or intimidated. I'd like you to consider joining that effort, at least temporarily." Chapter 9. The following weeks transformed Traoré's life in ways he had never anticipated. Rather than returning to his combat unit in the north, he found himself assigned to a newly formed task force charged with investigating foreign influence in the insurgency and developing new operational approaches to counter it. The task force operated from a secure facility within the Defense Ministry, working with a level of secrecy that was unusual even by military standards. Its members included intelligence analysts, operations specialists, and a carefully selected group of field commanders like Traoré, who brought practical experience from the front lines. Their investigation confirmed Traoré's initial suspicions and revealed an even more extensive network than he had imagined. The safe house he had discovered was just one node in a system that spread across Burkina Faso and into neighboring Mali and Niger. Foreign powers, primarily Russia, but with evidence of involvement from other nations as well, were providing not just weapons but also training, intelligence, communication support, and logistical coordination to various insurgent groups. The motivation behind this support was complex and multi-layered. Some of it appeared to be straightforward geopolitical competition, with foreign powers using the Sahel as a proxy battleground to counter Western influence in Africa. But there were also economic dimensions, mining interests, resource extraction rights, and commercial relationships that benefited from regional instability that weakened government control over natural resources. Most disturbing was evidence that some of the support was being provided through intermediaries within Burkina Faso itself, businessmen, minor officials, and even a few military personnel who had been compromised through corruption or ideological alignment with foreign interests. The insurgency wasn't just an external threat. It had internal enablers who profited from the chaos. As Traoré delved deeper into this investigation, he also became increasingly aware of the broader political situation in Burkina Faso. The government, while officially committed to fighting the insurgency, was hamstrung by its own weaknesses, corruption, inefficiency, and a political leadership that seemed more concerned with maintaining power than with genuine reform. The task force prepared briefings for political leadership, documenting their findings and recommending sweeping changes to security policy, foreign relations, and internal governance. But those recommendations seemed to disappear into the political machinery without generating meaningful action. Frustration grew among the task force members and in the wider military. Officers who had risked their lives fighting the insurgency watched as their political leaders seemed unable or unwilling to take the necessary steps to change the trajectory of the war. The disconnect between the sacrifice of soldiers in the field and the inaction of politicians in the capital became increasingly untenable. Traoré found himself in conversations that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Officers discussed not just tactics and operations, but fundamental questions about governance, about who should lead the country, about whether the existing political system was capable of the reforms necessary to win the war and rebuild the nation. The current government has had its chance, one major argued during a late-night discussion in the task force's secure conference room. So they've failed to protect the people, failed to reform the military, failed to address foreign interference. At some point, the military has a responsibility to step in, not out of ambition for power, but because no one else is capable of doing what needs to be done. Others were more cautious, warning about the dangers of military intervention in politics, the precedents it would set, the international reactions it might provoke. But even the cautious voices acknowledged the severity of the crisis and the inadequacy of current leadership. Traoré listened to these debates, wrestling with his own views. He had joined the military to serve Burkina Faso, not to involve himself in politics. But what did service mean when the political leadership was failing the people? What was an officer's duty when the choice was between passive obedience to a failing system and active intervention to change it? The question came into sharp focus when Colonel Damiba arrived in Ouagadougou for meetings with the task force. Damiba had been promoted to the leadership of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, MPSR, a group of reform-minded military officers who were openly advocating for political change. In a private meeting with Traoré, Damiba was direct. "Captain, the work you've done here has exposed truths that cannot be ignored, but exposing truths is not the same as acting on them. The political leadership has seen our findings and recommendations, and they've done nothing. They're incapable of the reforms necessary to win this war and protect our people. What are you suggesting, sir? Traoré asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Change, real change. The MPSR is planning to act, to remove the current government and establish a transitional administration that can implement the reforms our country desperately needs. We want officers like you, honest, dedicated, untainted by the corruption that has weakened our institutions, to be part of that transition. Traoré spent a sleepless night considering Damiba's words. Military intervention in politics was a serious step, one that carried risks both for the country and for those who participated in it. But the alternative, allowing the current trajectory to continue, watching as more soldiers died and more civilians suffered because of political failure, seemed equally unacceptable. By morning, he had made his decision. He would support the MPSR, would be part of the group that would attempt to change Burkina Faso's direction. Not out of personal ambition, he had no desire for political power, but out of conviction that his country needed change that only the military seemed capable of delivering. Chapter 10. The coup, when it came, was swift and largely bloodless. On a January morning, as Ouagadougou was just beginning to wake, military units moved into position around key government buildings. By afternoon, President Traoré had been taken into custody, and Colonel Damiba had announced the formation of a transitional government. The international reaction was predictably negative. Condemnations flowed from Western capitals, threats of sanctions were issued, and various international bodies called for an immediate return to civilian rule. But domestically, the coup received significant support, particularly from young people and those affected by the insurgency who saw the military intervention as a chance for genuine change. Traoré, now promoted to major in recognition of his role in exposing foreign interference in the insurgency, found himself part of the transitional government's security apparatus. His task was to implement the operational reforms that had been developed by the task force, reforms that the previous government had ignored. The changes were sweeping. Operational security protocols were overhauled, with sensitive information compartmentalized and shared only with personnel whose loyalty had been thoroughly verified. Foreign military advisors from countries suspected of supporting insurgents were expelled, replaced by carefully selected partnerships with nations whose interests aligned more closely with Burkina Faso's genuine security needs. But the most significant change was in the military's approach to the war itself. Instead of large, predictable operations that could be easily anticipated and countered, they shifted to smaller, more agile units operating with greater autonomy. Instead of relying on static defensive positions, they adopted more mobile tactics that kept insurgents off balance. Instead of treating the Sahel as a single theater, they developed region-specific approaches that took into account local dynamics and relationships. The results were not immediate, but they were noticeable. Insurgent attacks, while still frequent, became less coordinated. The sophisticated intelligence that had allowed militants to ambush convoys and avoid major operations seemed to deteriorate. Slowly, gradually, government forces began to recover territory that had been effectively ceded to insurgent control. But Traoré also saw the challenges that came with military governance. The MPSR had seized power promising reform, but actually implementing reform while managing the day-to-day responsibilities of government proved enormously difficult. Political prisoners were a constant issue. People detained under suspicion of collaboration with insurgents or opposition to the new government, with limited due process to determine actual guilt or innocence. The crackdown on corruption, while necessary, sometimes swept up innocent people alongside the genuinely corrupt, and the relationship with the international community, particularly Western powers that had previously provided support, deteriorated to the point where Burkina Faso was increasingly isolated diplomatically and economically. Traoré found himself in debates about these issues with other members of the transitional government. Some argued that the ends justified the means, that establishing security and rooting out foreign influence required harsh measures. Others, including Traoré, pushed for maintaining some level of due process and respect for human rights, arguing that becoming authoritarian in the name of security would ultimately undermine the very principles they claimed to be defending. The tensions came to a head when, after several months of transitional government, it became clear that Colonel Damiba was not moving quickly enough on key reforms. The operational improvements in fighting the insurgency were real, but broader governance reforms, anti-corruption measures, economic development, restoration of services to displaced populations were proceeding too slowly. Frustration grew among junior officers who had supported the coup specifically because they believed it would lead to rapid, meaningful change. Traoré found himself in the middle of this frustration, respected by both the transitional leadership and the younger officers who wanted more aggressive reform. Chapter 11. The breaking point came on a September afternoon when news reached Ouagadougou of another major ambush in the north. 11 soldiers had been killed, along with dozens of civilians in a supply convoy. The attack had succeeded despite the operational reforms that were supposed to have prevented exactly this kind of coordinated insurgent operation. Investigation revealed that security protocols had been relaxed in that sector, that intelligence about the convoy's route had been shared too widely, and that warnings from local commanders about increased insurgent activity had been ignored by higher headquarters. It was, in essence, a failure of leadership, a sign that the transitional government, despite its promises, was falling into the same patterns of inefficiency and poor decision-making that had characterized the previous administration. For Traoré and many other junior officers, this was the final straw. They had risked their careers and lives to expose foreign interference in the insurgency, had supported a military coup based on promises of reform, and now were watching as those reforms stalled and soldiers continued to die unnecessarily. A group of captains and majors, Traoré among them, began meeting to discuss what should be done. The conversations were careful, coded, aware that what they were considering amounted to a second coup against the very government they had helped bring to power, but they were also driven by genuine conviction that leadership changes were necessary if the war was to be won and the country stabilized. Damiba meant well, one major argued, but he's been captured by the same political dynamics that paralyzed the previous government. He's making compromises to maintain international support, trying to balance too many competing interests, instead of focusing single-mindedly on what Burkina Faso needs. So what's the alternative? Another officer challenged. Another coup. How many times can we change governments before we lose all credibility, before we become just another unstable African state, lurching from crisis to crisis? Traoré had been listening but finally spoke up. The alternative is leadership that understands the urgency of our situation and has the will to act decisively, not for personal power, not for international approval, but for Burkina Faso itself. Someone who will make the hard choices that need to be made, even when those choices make powerful people uncomfortable. The others looked at him, and Traoré saw something in their expressions: recognition, respect, and perhaps an expectation he hadn't fully anticipated. They weren't just discussing who should lead, they were discussing whether he should lead. You've been at the center of every significant reform we've achieved. Lieutenant Kabore, who had followed Traoré from their northern command, said, "You discovered the foreign interference, you helped develop the new operational approaches, and you've been the voice pushing for genuine change rather than half measures. The soldiers trust you because you were one of them, fighting on the front lines. The people respect you because you've been honest about the challenges we face. If we're going to do this, if we're going to push for change again, you need to be the one to lead it." Traoré felt the weight of that statement. He was still young, in his early 30s, with relatively little command experience compared to senior officers, but he had something they lacked: moral authority derived from his actions, credibility earned through his discoveries about foreign interference, and a reputation for integrity that had not been compromised by political maneuvering. The decision to act came days later, when the group learned that Damiba was planning to extend the transition period and was making overtures to international bodies that would effectively restore some of the foreign relationships the first coup had severed. For those who believed that foreign interference was the core problem, undermining Burkina Faso's security, this was unacceptable. On a September evening, military units under the command of Traoré and other reform-minded officers moved into position around key government buildings. By the next morning, Damiba had been removed from power, and Traoré found himself, at age 34, leading the country as interim president. The international reaction was even harsher than it had been for the first coup. But domestically, there was significant support. particularly from young people who saw in Traoré someone who represented a genuine break from both the old political class and the compromised transitional government. In his first address to the nation, Traoré was direct and uncompromising. Burkina Faso is at war, not just against insurgents, but against foreign powers who seek to use our land as a proxy battleground. We will not win this war through compromise, or by trying to please international interests that do not share our priorities. We will win it through dedication to our sovereignty, through operational effectiveness, and through putting the interests of Burkinabe people above all other considerations. He announced a series of immediate measures: severance of military ties with countries suspected of supporting insurgents, increased operational autonomy for field commanders, expedited trials for those accused of collaboration with foreign interests, and a mobilization program to recruit and train additional forces. But he also announced something else, something that surprised many observers. This government is transitional, with the sole purpose of restoring security and establishing the conditions for genuine democratic governance. We will not hold power for its own sake. When we have achieved our military objectives and created a stable foundation for civilian rule, we will organize elections and return authority to civilian leadership. But we will not do so prematurely, before the conditions for success have been established. The mistakes of the past, transferring power before security was achieved, allowing corruption and foreign influence to undermine governance, will not be repeated. Chapter 12. The months that followed were among the most challenging in Burkina Faso's modern history. Traoré's government implemented aggressive counterinsurgency operations, pushing into areas that had been effectively controlled by militants for years. The fighting was intense, and casualties were high on all sides. But slowly, measurably, the security situation began to improve. But military success came with costs. The relationship with the international community, particularly Western powers, deteriorated to the point of open hostility. Economic sanctions were imposed, development aid was suspended, and Burkina Faso found itself increasingly isolated. Traoré responded by forging new partnerships with Russia, with Turkey, with China, countries willing to engage with his government despite international criticism. These new partnerships brought their own complications. The very foreign influence that Traoré had first exposed was now being courted, albeit under different terms and with greater transparency about interests and expectations. It was a pragmatic choice, born of necessity, but one that troubled some of those who had initially supported his rise to power. Traoré also faced internal challenges. Some of the measures his government implemented, mass mobilization, restricted press freedom in security-sensitive areas, detention of suspected collaborators, generated criticism from human rights organizations and opposition groups. He found himself in the difficult position of defending actions he believed were necessary for security, while acknowledging that they came at a cost to civil liberties. In a rare interview with an African media organization, Traoré addressed these criticisms directly. "I understand the concerns about our methods, but I would ask critics to consider the alternative. We inherited a country where insurgents controlled vast territories, where millions of people were displaced, where foreign powers were actively fueling conflict to serve their own interests. Restoring security requires difficult choices. Yes, we've restricted some freedoms temporarily. Yes, we've taken strong action against those who collaborate with our enemies. But these measures are temporary, necessary steps toward establishing the stable conditions where genuine democracy and full civil liberties can function." He paused, then added, "A slave who cannot assume his own revolt does not deserve to be pitied." Burkina Faso was becoming a slave to foreign interests, to insurgent violence, to the failure of leadership to make hard choices. "We have chosen revolt, not violent or chaotic, but determined and principled. We will reclaim our sovereignty, restore our security, and rebuild our country on foundations that cannot be undermined by external manipulation." As months turned into years, the results of Traoré's approach became clearer. The insurgency, while not defeated, was significantly degraded. Displaced populations began returning to their villages, protected by a military that was better equipped, better trained, and better led than at any point since the crisis began. Economic development projects, funded by the country's own resources rather than foreign aid, began creating opportunities for young people who had previously seen only displacement and violence in their futures. But Traoré also remained acutely aware of the path he had traveled, from a geology student to a soldier, from a captain on patrol to the leader of his nation. He had discovered truths that powerful interests wanted to keep hidden, had taken risks that could have ended his career or life, and had ultimately helped reshape his country's trajectory. In quiet moments, when he allowed himself to reflect, Traoré thought about that day in the desert, when he had entered an abandoned building and found evidence that would change everything. It seemed like another lifetime, though it had been less than 2 years. That discovery had set in motion a chain of events that led to coups, conflict, and transformation. Had it been worth it? The answer depended on the perspective. For the soldiers who fought with better support and clearer objectives than before, yes. For the displaced people who could now begin rebuilding their lives, yes. For those who valued civil liberties that had been temporarily restricted, or for those who preferred the country's previous foreign relationships, perhaps not. But for Traoré, the answer was simpler. He had acted according to his convictions, had pursued truth even when it was uncomfortable, and had accepted the responsibilities that came with that pursuit. Burkina Faso's future was not yet secured. The challenges ahead remained immense, and his own path forward was uncertain. But the country was no longer drifting toward collapse, no longer a passive victim of foreign interference and failed leadership. As he stood on the balcony of the presidential residence, looking out over Ouagadougou as evening fell, Traoré reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The abandoned building in the desert had been a threshold, a moment when the choice between comfortable ignorance and uncomfortable truth had presented itself. He had chosen truth, with all its complications and costs. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Elections would eventually need to be held, power transferred to civilian leadership, and the emergency measures rolled back. International relationships would need to be rebuilt, economic development accelerated, and the underlying social tensions that had made insurgency possible addressed through genuine governance reform. But for now, for this moment, Burkina Faso had reclaimed its sovereignty, its dignity, and its future, and that, Traoré believed, was worth every difficult choice, every sacrifice, and every risk he had taken since that day in the desert when everything had changed. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sounds of the city, voices, laughter, the normal rhythms of life that had seemed so threatened just years before. Somewhere in the north, soldiers were still on patrol, still watching for threats, still protecting the fragile peace that had been so hard won. And somewhere, perhaps, young officers were making their own discoveries, finding their own truths, beginning their own journeys toward leadership and responsibility. The future remained unwritten, full of possibilities, both hopeful and challenging. But it would be Burkina Faso's future, shaped by its own people, defended by its own forces, determined by its own choices, and for a country that had come so close to losing its independence to foreign manipulation and insurgent violence, that was everything. End.